My name is Catherine Ross. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've occupied a role that doesn't draw attention. I'm not loud. I don't dominate rooms. I don't win arguments by force or volume. I'm the kind of woman people describe as reasonable, steady, or easy to talk to. The kind they assume will understand. The kind they believe won't push back. That perception followed me everywhere: work, friendships, and especially family. I was the dependable one, the listener, the daughter who didn't cause problems. If there was tension, I smoothed it. If there was discomfort, I absorbed it. Not because I lacked opinions or strength, but because I believed restraint was a form of maturity. This story isn't about sudden rebellion or dramatic revenge. It's about a slow, quiet unraveling of something I once called loyalty. It's about how control came disguised as concern, and how long it took me to see the difference. When people hear the title, "My Parents Threatened to Disown Me Unless I Handed Over My $25,000 Savings," they often expect shouting, ultimatums, or a single explosive argument. That isn't what happened. What unfolded was far more subtle: a gradual tightening, small expectations framed as love, advice that wasn't really optional, boundaries that were never acknowledged, only stepped over politely. This is a story about power that never announces itself, about how being the good one can quietly cost you your agency, about realizing that being trusted to sacrifice is not the same as being respected. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through the emotional terrain of that realization, who I was to them. The first moments I dismissed because they seemed too small to matter. The role I was assigned without ever agreeing to it. And the internal shift that changed everything, without confrontation, without theatrics, without cruelty. I'm not sharing this to punish anyone. I'm not here to prove that I won. There is no victory speech waiting at the end. What I offer instead is clarity, the kind that comes when you finally name what's been happening to you and decide, quietly, that it ends here. If you're listening because you've ever been valued mainly for your compliance, if you've ever been told that love requires access to your resources, your time, or your silence, then this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. I'll tell it honestly, without exaggeration, without villainizing. Just one woman documenting the moment she stopped confusing obligation with love. Before we begin, I want to ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever wondered whether the people who say they worry about you are actually afraid of losing control? To my parents, I was the easy one. That was the word they used most often, always with a smile, always as a compliment. Easy to raise, easy to talk to, easy to rely on. I didn't argue much as a teenager. I didn't slam doors or demand explanations. When rules were vague, I followed them anyway. When expectations shifted, I adjusted. I learned early that harmony was rewarded, and resistance, even polite resistance, was met with disappointment that lingered longer than any argument. My younger cousins used to joke that I was the responsible one, the one adults trusted with keys, schedules, and important phone calls. At family gatherings, my mother would introduce me with a tone that suggested quiet pride. "Catherine is very sensible." My father would nod and add, "She understands how things work." What neither of them ever said out loud was what that role truly meant. Sensible meant I didn't ask for much. Understanding meant I didn't question decisions already made. I internalized that image so completely that I rarely noticed how invisible it made me. When family plans were discussed, my input was often assumed rather than requested. If I hesitated, it was interpreted as agreement that just needed time to surface. If I expressed doubt, it was smoothed over with reassurance instead of addressed. "You'll be fine," my mother would say gently, whenever something inconvenienced me. "You always figure it out," my father would add, as if that settled the matter. They weren't cruel people. That's important to say. They worked hard, they worried about the world, they believed deeply in family loyalty and sacrifice. And because I didn't rebel against those values, I became their proof that the system worked. At least that's how it looked from the outside. Inside, I was learning something quieter and far more dangerous, that my worth was tied to how little friction I caused, that being loved meant being useful, that needing less made it easier to keep. When I moved out in my mid-20s, nothing fundamentally changed. I was independent, yes, but still emotionally tethered. I called regularly. I updated them on my finances, my plans, my worries, not because they demanded it outright, but because it felt expected. Transparency was framed as closeness. Privacy was subtly discouraged. Whenever I made a decision they wouldn't have chosen, it was met with concern rather than criticism. Are you sure that's wise? We just want to make sure you're protected. You know we only say this because we care. Control came disguised as concern. And because the tone was soft, because the words were loving, I never thought to question the pattern. I told myself this was normal. Those parents worried that guidance was part of love, that discomfort was the price of being close. If there was resentment, it stayed buried. If there was an imbalance, I rationalized it. After all, I wasn't being shouted at. I wasn't being threatened. I wasn't being told what to do, at least not explicitly. What I was being taught, slowly and consistently, was that my autonomy was conditional, that independence was admirable only as long as it aligned with their comfort, that my role was not to lead my own life, but to manage theirs emotionally. I became very good at reading the room, at anticipating reactions. I preemptively adjusted my choices so conversations would go smoothly. It looked like maturity. It felt like exhaustion I couldn't quite name. Friends would sometimes comment on how close I was to my parents. I'd smile and agree. It was easier than explaining the subtle pressure that lived beneath every phone call. Easier than admitting I didn't know where my responsibility ended and theirs began. I didn't see myself as controlled. I saw myself as considerate. That distinction mattered to me until one day it didn't. But before anything broke, before any line was crossed openly, this is who I was to them. The reliable daughter, the calm presence, the one who would understand. And because I understood so well, no one thought to ask whether I agreed. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel dramatic at the time. That's what makes it easy to overlook, even in hindsight. There was no argument, no raised voices, no ultimatum. Just a comment, delivered gently, that settled into me in a way I couldn't immediately explain. It happened during a casual visit home. I had stopped by for the weekend, bringing groceries, as I often did. We were standing in the kitchen, my mother rinsing vegetables, my father reading something on his phone, when the conversation drifted, as it usually did, toward practical matters. "How are your savings coming along?" my mother asked, without looking up. It wasn't an unusual question. They had always framed financial curiosity as responsibility. I answered honestly, mentioning that I'd finally crossed a personal milestone. Not the number, just the relief of it. Years of careful budgeting, saying no to things I wanted, building something that felt like safety. My father looked up then, smiled. "That's good," he said. "It's smart to be prepared." My mother nodded. "Especially these days, you never know what might happen." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just intentional. "You know," she continued, "families should look out for each other. Money is just money. What matters is being there when it counts." I remember feeling a slight tightening in my chest. Not fear, not anger, just alertness. "I agree," I said, and I meant it. But then she added, "It's comforting to know you're in a position to help, if needed." She finally looked at me when she said that. Her tone was warm, proud even, and in that moment, something shifted, so subtly that I almost missed it. Because I hadn't offered, and she hadn't asked. Yet a conclusion had already been drawn. I smiled because that was what I always did. I said something non-committal. The conversation moved on. We talked about the weather, about a neighbour's new car, about nothing at all. But later that night, lying in the guest room I'd slept in since childhood, the sentence replayed in my mind. "It's comforting to know you're in a position to help. Not if I chose to, not if I was comfortable, just that I could." It was a small cut, clean, almost invisible. No one else in the room would have noticed it, and I told myself it didn't matter, that I was being overly sensitive, that families talked like this all the time. Still, something about it stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, similar comments surfaced, casual references to shared responsibility, light jokes about how I was the stable one now, remarks about how independence didn't mean forgetting where you came from. Each time, I nodded. Each time I reassured. Each time I felt a faint pressure settle a little deeper. What struck me most wasn't what they said. It was what they assumed. There was no curiosity about my plans, No questions about what that money represented to me. No acknowledgement that saving it had required sacrifice. My effort was invisible. My ownership was implied away. When I mentioned possibly using part of it for a future move or additional training, my father frowned slightly. Not in disapproval, in concern. "Just be careful," he said. "You don't want to limit your flexibility." It sounded reasonable, protective even, but whose flexibility was he really talking about? I didn't push back. I didn't even realize I could. The idea that my savings were entirely mine, that their purpose was something I defined, had never been tested. And because it hadn't been tested, I assumed it was secure. That's the danger of the first small cut. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't hurt enough to demand attention. It just changes the shape of things quietly. Everyone else moved on. My parents likely forgot the conversation entirely. To them, nothing had happened. But I remembered it, not as a conflict, as a signal. After that first small cut, nothing in my life visibly changed. There were no new rules, no explicit expectations, no requests that crossed a clear line, and that was exactly why it worked. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it shows up as familiarity that assumes permission. The comments continued, spaced far enough apart to feel harmless. A remark here, a suggestion there, always framed as care, always delivered in that calm, reasonable tone that made disagreement feel unnecessary, almost rude. My mother would mention expenses they were thinking through, usually in passing. A home repair, a medical bill, a relative who needed help. She never asked for anything directly. She didn't need to. The implication hovered in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. "You're lucky you're good with money," she'd say. "Not everyone plans as well as you do." It must be nice to have that kind of cushion. Each sentence carried the same quiet message. You have more than you need. Others don't. What kind of person would you be if you didn't help? I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting, that my parents had sacrificed plenty for me, and this was simply the cycle of adulthood turning. Parents give, children give back. That's how families work. And so I stayed quiet. When my father offered advice on how much I should keep liquid versus invested, without knowing my full situation, I listened politely. When my mother suggested that holding too much money alone could be selfish, I laughed it off. "It's just a mindset thing," she said once. "You don't want money to make you close off." Closed off? From whom? I noticed that my boundaries were never discussed, only bypassed. My comfort level was never checked, only assumed. If I hesitated, the pause was filled quickly with reassurance that sounded like persuasion. "We'd never put you in a bad position. We'd only ask if it was truly necessary. You know we'd do the same for you." The problem was that no one was actually asking. They were rehearsing a future in which my compliance was already written into the script. I normalized it because it was easier than confronting the alternative, that my role in the family wasn't evolving, just becoming more expensive. Friends noticed changes before I did. I'd mention a conversation, a comment, and they'd tilt their heads slightly. "That's a lot of interest in your finances," one of them said carefully. "They're just worried," I replied automatically. "They've always been like that." And that was true. They had always been like that. The difference was that now I had something they cared about controlling. The more stable I became, the more attention my stability attracted. I found myself pre-editing information before phone calls, downplaying raises, avoiding specifics, not because I was hiding anything, but because I didn't want the conversation that followed. That should have been a warning. Instead, I treated it like a communication issue. If I just explained better, if I just reassured them enough, if I stayed calm and patient, everything would remain balanced. But balance requires mutual respect. And what was happening wasn't balance, it was erosion. I was teaching them, unintentionally, that access to me included access to my resources, that my silence meant agreement, that my discomfort wasn't important enough to slow things down. And because I never said no outright, the idea that I might became increasingly unthinkable to them and to me. This is how patterns harden. Not through force, but through repetition. Not through cruelty, but through convenience. They grew comfortable assuming. I grew comfortable accommodating. By the time I noticed how far things had shifted, the assumptions felt established, normal, almost inevitable. That's the most unsettling part of looking back now. Not that they pushed, but that I helped them push by standing still. I didn't see it as disrespect then. I saw it as family dynamics, as generational differences. Love is expressed imperfectly. It would take something much clearer, something impossible to rationalize, for me to finally stop explaining their behavior away. But by then, the groundwork had already been laid. I didn't realize I'd been assigned a role until I noticed how uncomfortable it made everyone when I stepped even slightly outside of it. The role was never stated explicitly. No one sat me down and explained expectations. It emerged through repetition, through praise, through subtle correction. I was the reliable one, the rational one, the one who didn't need much and therefore could give more. In family conversations, my parents spoke about me in ways that felt oddly final, as if my character had already been decided. Catherine doesn't really spend on herself. She's not impulsive. She understands long-term thinking. They said these things proudly, but also possessively, as though these traits weren't choices I made, but features they could count on. When relatives needed help organizing paperwork or navigating systems, my name came up. When something required patience, discretion, or follow-through, it was assumed I'd handle it. I didn't mind being capable. What I hadn't noticed was how rarely that capability was paired with consideration. My needs didn't disappear. They just stopped being relevant. The role required me to be calm when others were emotional, flexible when others were fixed, generous when others were strained, and because I fulfilled it so well, the role solidified. What struck me later was how narrow the role actually was. There was no space in it for uncertainty, or refusal, or reprioritization. I could be many things, supportive, understanding, patient, but I couldn't be unavailable. The first time I hinted at pulling back, it was met with confusion. I might need to focus on my own plans for a while, I said once, carefully. My mother smiled, but her voice tightened. Of course, we all have to juggle things. You're just so good at managing everything. It sounded like encouragement. It felt like a reminder. My father took a different approach. You've always been strong, he said. That's just who you are. As if strength were a fixed identity, not something that could be exhausted. I began to see how the role protected them from discomfort. If I were always okay, they didn't have to worry about crossing lines. If I were always capable, they wouldn't have to ask permission. My reliability made their assumptions feel safe. And I let it continue because the alternative felt selfish. Because stepping out of the role meant disappointing people who had invested in that version of me. There's a quiet pressure that comes with being the good one. You're not controlled by fear, you're controlled by reputation. By the image others have built around you. By the unspoken rule that says, don't change now, we're used to you this way. I started noticing how often my parents spoke in terms of we when referencing decisions that affected me. We should think about what's best. We need to be careful. We don't want you to make a mistake. The collective language erased the boundary between their concerns and my choices. And because I valued connection, I allowed that boundary to blur. What I didn't see yet was that roles like this don't adapt when circumstances change. They demand consistency, even at your expense. By the time I fully understood the role I'd been assigned, it was already being tested. Not with anger, not with force, but with expectation. And expectations, once violated, carry consequences that you face. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no dramatic realization, no moment where I finally said what I'd been rehearsing in my head. In fact, outwardly, everything looked exactly the same. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting alone in my apartment, reviewing my finances. Not because anything was wrong, but because it had become a habit. I tracked things carefully. I liked knowing where I stood. That sense of order had always made me feel grounded. That day I lingered longer than usual on one number, $25,000, not as a symbol of wealth, not as something impressive, but as time. As a restraint. Years of choosing stability over impulse, as proof that I could take care of myself. And for the first time, a question surfaced that I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. Who does this belong to, emotionally? Legally, the answer was simple. But emotionally, it felt complicated, entangled, as if the money existed in a shared space between expectation and obligation, rather than fully in my own life. That realization unsettled me. I thought back to the comments, the assumptions, The way my savings had been folded into family conversations without ever being invited in. I noticed how often I'd felt the need to justify not spending it on others, even though no one had explicitly demanded it yet. Yet, what struck me wasn't fear, it was clarity. A quiet understanding that something important had already been decided without me. I remembered my mother's voice. It's comforting to know you're in a position to help. Not asking, not discussing, just placing the weight of reassurance on my shoulders. In that moment, I saw the pattern not as isolated remarks, but as a system. One that relied on my silence. One that worked only if I continued to see myself as a resource before I saw myself as a person with limits. There was no anger in the realization, just a subtle recalibration, like stepping back from a painting you've been standing too close to. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call my parents. I didn't even write anything down. I just stopped explaining things to myself. I stopped telling myself they meant well. Stopped telling myself I was overreacting. Stopped telling myself that love and access were the same thing. That was the shift. It happened entirely inside me, which is why no one noticed. Later that week, my mother called. The conversation was routine. Updates, small talk, shared complaints about the world. At one point, she mentioned an upcoming expense they were worried about. She didn't ask for help. She didn't need to. Normally, I would have jumped in with reassurance. We'll figure it out. Let me know what you need. Don't stress. This time I didn't. I listened. I acknowledged her worry, and then I let the silence sit. She filled it quickly, as if surprised it was there. Anyway, she said, changing the subject. When we hung up, my hands were shaking slightly. Not from guilt, from awareness. I had broken a pattern, however small, and the world hadn't collapsed. That's when I understood something essential. My compliance had been doing a lot of invisible work, and withdrawing it, even gently, changed the shape of conversations. From that day on, I paid attention. Not to what was said, but to what was assumed. How often my parents spoke as though my future decisions were already accounted for. How rarely they asked what I wanted without attaching concern to the answer. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. I simply observed. Because once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you stop automatically stepping into it, you create space. That space was uncomfortable, but it was mine. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while. Not defiance, not rebellion, but quiet ownership. The shift wasn't loud. It was irreversible. After that internal shift, my silence changed texture. Before, silence had been reflexive, a way to keep things smooth. A pause meant to invite others to continue, to reassure them that I was listening, that I agreed enough not to object. It was a silence that served the room. Now it has become intentional. I still spoke kindly. I still listened, but I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped volunteering reassurance before anyone asked for it. I stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't actually being placed in my hands. Yet. The difference was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed for long. My parents began to circle topics more deliberately. Conversations that used to drift casually toward finances now paused, as if waiting for me to steer them there. When I didn't, the pause stretched. "You've been quiet lately," my mother said once, half joking. "Just busy," I replied, which was true. She laughed, but her eyes searched my face through the phone. "Well, you know we like hearing from you." I did know. What I also knew now was how often hearing from me had meant being reassured by me. My father tried a different approach. He framed questions more directly, though still gently. "Are you feeling secure these days? Do you feel prepared if something unexpected happens?" They sounded concerned. They were also probes. I answered honestly, but narrowly. "Yes. I'm comfortable. I have plans." I didn't elaborate. What fascinated me was how quickly my restraint was misread. They didn't think I was setting boundaries. They thought I was overwhelmed, or distracted, or maybe quietly struggling. Their concern intensified, but not in a way that involved listening. "You don't have to carry everything alone," my mother reminded me. "We're family," my father added. "We look out for each other." The phrase "look out for each other" had always been their favorite. It sounded mutual, balanced, fair. But now I heard the asymmetry in it. Looking out in their language meant staying informed, staying involved, staying central to my decisions, and my silence disrupted that access. I noticed how often they tried to reassert familiarity. "We know you." You've always been this way. You're not the type to. The sentences trailed off, unfinished, as if they didn't yet know how to describe the version of me who wasn't volunteering herself so freely. What they mistook for weakness was actually calibration. I was learning how little I needed to say to remain truthful. How much of my life could I keep private without lying? How silence, when chosen, could hold its own weight. And in that quiet, I began to prepare. Not for confrontation, for independence. I reviewed documents, updated passwords, ensured my accounts were structured clearly and securely. I didn't do any of this out of fear. It felt more like putting important papers in order before a long trip. I also started writing things down. Not in a dramatic way, just notes, dates, phrases that stood out, patterns I'd once dismissed. Seeing them in ink removed any lingering doubt. This wasn't miscommunication. It was an expectation without consent. My parents, sensing a shift they couldn't quite define, grew more explicit. There may come a time, my mother said one evening, when family needs to pull together. I nodded. That's true. She waited. I didn't add anything. The silence between us stretched longer than usual. Not tense, just unfamiliar. That was when I understood something crucial. Silence was no longer something happening to me. It was something I was doing. And by choosing it, I was changing the rules without ever announcing that I had. They assumed silence meant uncertainty. I knew it meant clarity. They assumed silence meant I hadn't decided yet. I knew it meant I already had. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more they revealed about their expectations, their comfort with entitlement, and how quickly concern could turn into pressure when reassurance was withheld. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was unreadable. What they never noticed was how much space my silence created. While they were adjusting to a version of me that no longer filled every gap, I was using that quiet to see clearly. Not emotionally, strategically. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I was observing patterns with the same care I'd once used to manage everyone else's comfort. And because no one thought I was capable of withdrawing, no one imagined I was preparing. I paid attention to timing, when certain topics came up, when concern turned into insistence, when language shifted from "we worry" to "we expect." I noticed how often the idea of family unity surfaced right before a request that would require my sacrifice. I also noticed something else. How little they asked about my inner life. They asked whether I was okay. They asked whether I was secure. They asked whether I was thinking ahead. They never asked what I wanted. That omission told me everything I needed to know. In the background, I strengthened the parts of my life they couldn't reach. I diversified my savings. I clarified legal ownership. I ensured that every account, every document, every decision trail was clean and unmistakably mine. None of this was dramatic. It was methodical, quiet, boring even, and that was the point. Power doesn't always announce itself with bold moves. Sometimes it accumulates through consistency. I also adjusted my emotional habits. I stopped sharing anxieties that could be used as leverage. I stopped framing my choices as tentative. I spoke less about the future and more about the present. "I'm handling things," became my default response. What fascinated me was how often that unsettled them. My parents were used to being consulted, used to being factored in, used to their approval acting as a kind of emotional seal. When that stopped happening automatically, they tried to reinsert themselves, not forcefully, but persistently. "You don't seem like yourself lately," my mother said one afternoon. "I feel fine," I replied. "Well, different," she pressed. "More distant. Different." Yes. Distant. Only from expectations that were never negotiated. My father took a more practical tone. "You know, when you're part of a family, big decisions affect more than just one person." I met his gaze evenly. "Some do." He nodded, but something in his expression shifted. Not anger, calculation. That was the first time I saw it clearly. They were adjusting their strategy. And still, they never noticed what mattered most. They didn't notice that I'd stopped centering my identity around being dependable. They didn't notice that I'd reclaimed my time mentally. They didn't notice that I was no longer asking myself how my choices would land with them before making them. Because on the surface, I was the same. Polite, calm, available enough. That's the advantage of quiet change. It doesn't trigger defenses. In those months, I also confronted something uncomfortable within myself. Grief. Not for the relationship as it was, but for the illusion I'd maintained about it. I mourned the idea that my parents would naturally adjust to my adulthood without resistance. That love would expand rather than contract when control loosened. Letting go of that hope hurt more than any argument would have, but it also freed me. I stopped waiting for permission I was never going to receive. Stopped expecting acknowledgement that might never come. Stopped imagining a future conversation where everything would be explained and understood. Instead, I focused on alignment between my values and my actions. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want distance for its own sake. I wanted sovereignty, the right to decide without fear of emotional consequences, the right to say no without justifying my worth. And slowly, quietly, I positioned my life so that when the moment came, because I knew it would come, I wouldn't be cornered. They still saw me as the reliable one. They had no idea that reliability, once withdrawn, would leave a vacuum they couldn't fill. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like resistance. It looked like maturity. And by the time they realized something had changed, the groundwork was already complete. The private reveal didn't come from a conversation. It came from a document. I was sitting at my desk one evening, reviewing paperwork I'd already gone through dozens of times. Account statements, notes I'd written to myself, a timeline of comments and moments that, on their own, looked harmless, but together formed a clear arc. And suddenly, without drama, without shock, I saw it. The leverage wasn't the money itself. It was the assumption of access. My parents weren't counting on my savings because they needed it immediately. They were counting on it because it stabilized their sense of control. Knowing it existed and believing it was emotionally shared gave them security. It softened their own uncertainties. It allowed them to plan without fully confronting their limits. My $25,000 wasn't a solution to a crisis. It was a psychological buffer. That was the reveal. And once I saw it, everything snapped into focus. This was never about generosity. It was about predictability, about knowing that if something went wrong, I would absorb the impact, that I would step in quietly, without complaint, without changing how they saw themselves. They didn't want my money. They wanted the guarantee. And guarantees only work if they're unquestioned. I realized then why my silence had unsettled them so deeply. It wasn't that I'd changed, it was that I'd become uncertain to them. And uncertainty is threatening when you've built comfort on someone else's reliability. I sat back and felt something close to relief, because leverage once identified loses its power. I also recognized something else. They didn't actually know the details. They knew a number, an estimate, a comforting idea. But they didn't know how my finances were structured. They didn't know what was liquid and what wasn't. They didn't know what commitments I'd already made to myself. Their confidence was built on familiarity, not facts. And that meant the power dynamic was far less solid than it appeared. There was no satisfaction in this realization, no sense of triumph, just clarity, the kind that quiets anxiety rather than feeding it. I stopped wondering how bad things could get. I started asking how cleanly I could disengage. From that point on, every interaction took on a new dimension. Not emotionally, but informationally. I listened for assumptions, for phrases that implied entitlement, for moments when concern tipped into expectation. And I kept notes, not as ammunition, but as confirmation, so I wouldn't second-guess myself later, so I wouldn't rewrite history to make everyone comfortable again. One evening, my mother said something that sealed it. "You know," she said, "if something ever happened and you didn't help, I don't know what that would say about family." Her voice was calm, almost reflective, but there it was. The conditionality, finally stated. Help or redefine yourself as disloyal. I didn't respond immediately. I let the sentence sit between us. Then I said evenly, "I hope it never comes to that." She smiled, relieved, as if I'd agreed. But internally, I understood the truth. The line had already been drawn, not by me. That night, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. Concern becomes coercion the moment refusal is punished. That was the private reveal. Not just about them, but about me. I had been protecting their comfort at the expense of my clarity. And once I stopped doing that, the structure holding everything together began to show its cracks. I didn't need to confront them yet. I didn't need to explain myself. The leverage had shifted simply because I no longer believed in it. From that moment forward, my goal wasn't to change them. It was to make sure that when the pressure finally surfaced in full, because I knew it would be standing on ground that couldn't be negotiated away. Quietly, legally, irreversibly. The decision point didn't arrive with urgency. It arrived with certainty. By then, I had already accepted that a moment would come when silence would no longer be enough. when concern would sharpen into something more explicit, when my parents would stop implying and start asking, perhaps even demanding. What I hadn't known was how calmly that knowledge would settle in me. I began to imagine the possible paths forward, not as fantasies, but as practical scenarios. One option was compliance, handing over the money or a portion of it, framing it as help, preserving the image of harmony. It would buy temporary peace at the cost of reinforcing the role I was already trying to step out of. Another option was partial resistance, negotiating, offering conditions, explaining my boundaries in careful language, hoping to be understood. This option looked reasonable on paper, but I knew it would invite debate, justification, emotional bargaining, a slow erosion disguised as conversation. The third option was refusal, clear, unambiguous, no performance, no over-explaining. That option came with consequences I couldn't fully predict, but I could predict one thing with absolute clarity. Once I chose it, there would be no going back. Refusal would change how they saw me, permanently. And strangely, that thought didn't scare me anymore. What scared me was the alternative, remaining legible in a role that required my ongoing self-erasure. I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What do I owe them, and what do I owe myself? The answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't philosophical. It was practical. I owed them honesty. I owed myself autonomy. Those two things were not in conflict unless honesty threatened access. That was the point where I understood the decision had already been made. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. In the days leading up to it, I felt oddly peaceful, focused. I didn't rehearse arguments. I didn't prepare explanations. I prepared the structure. I ensured my finances were untouchable without my consent. I double-checked that no account had shared access. I reviewed my legal documents, my beneficiaries, and my emergency contacts. I also prepared myself emotionally, not for guilt, but for distortion. I knew my refusal wouldn't be heard as neutrality. It would be reframed as betrayal, as selfishness, as evidence that I had changed in the worst possible way. I accepted that in advance. The moment arrived on a quiet evening phone call. My mother spoke carefully, her voice unusually measured. She mentioned a situation, vague but heavy, expenses, stress, uncertainty. Then she said it. "Catherine, we need to know we can count on you." There it was. No number yet, no specifics, just the invocation of loyalty. I took a breath, not to steady myself but to mark the moment. "What does that mean?" I asked. There was a pause, a recalibration. "It means," she said slowly, "that family doesn't turn its back when help is needed." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't raise my voice. "I'm not able to offer financial support," I said. The sentence felt solid as it left my mouth. Not defensive, not apologetic, just true. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that reveals shock. My father joined the call then, his tone tight but controlled. "Are you saying you wouldn't help us?" "I'm saying I won't give you my savings," I replied. The distinction mattered, to me. To them it didn't. That was the moment of no return. I felt it. Not as regret, but as alignment. A quiet click into place. The sense that whatever came next, I would not have to contort myself to survive it. The decision wasn't made in anger. It wasn't fueled by revenge. It was made in clarity. And clarity, once spoken, cannot be negotiated. After the decision was spoken, something unexpected happened. Nothing. At least not right away. There was no immediate explosion, no dramatic confrontation. The call ended politely, stiffly. My parents said they needed time to think. I agreed. And life on the surface continued. That's the thing about irreversible choices. They often feel anticlimactic in the moment. But underneath that calm, I knew movement had begun. Not emotionally, but structurally. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now I needed to make sure the ground I stood on was stable. So I moved in silence. I didn't announce boundaries. I enforced them through systems. I separated any lingering financial ties, however minor. Shared subscriptions were cancelled. Informal arrangements clarified. Anything that could be framed later as, "But you always helped with this," was resolved cleanly and quietly. I also adjusted communication. I stopped initiating calls. I responded when contacted, but I no longer filled the space with updates or reassurance. Conversations became shorter, focused, polite. What struck me was how quickly absence created narrative. "You seem distant," my mother said during one call. I've been focused on work, I replied. That was true. It was also incomplete, and I was no longer interested in completeness. My father tried to reassert normalcy through logistics. He asked about my schedule, my plans, my timeline. Questions that once felt caring now felt like inventory. I answered selectively. Not evasively, just selectively. In parallel, I fortified my independence further. I increased my emergency fund beyond the amount they knew about. I consulted a financial advisor, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted confirmation that my choices were sound. They were. Each small action reinforced something essential. My security no longer depended on anyone's approval. And still no one confronted me directly. That silence wasn't peace, it was a recalculation. I could feel it in the way my parents spoke more carefully, as if testing language. In the way they referenced family values without attaching specifics. In the way they hinted at consequences without naming them. People remember who shows up, my mother said once. I agree, I replied. I didn't ask who she meant. That was the quiet power of moving in silence. You don't need to challenge implications, you just don't confirm them. I also prepared myself for escalation. Not by rehearsing arguments, but by accepting outcomes. I accepted that they might withdraw affection, that they might rewrite the story, that they might frame me as cold or ungrateful. I made peace with all of it before it happened, because the alternative, returning to the role, was no longer available to me. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not numb, calm, as if my nervous system finally recognized that I was acting in my own interest without harming anyone else. Silence in this phase wasn't passive, it was protective. I wasn't hiding, I was consolidating. And as the days passed, I noticed something subtle but important. My parents' certainty began to crack. Their confidence that I would eventually soften, explain, reconsider, it wavered. They had always relied on my predictability. Now they had none. Moving in silence didn't make me invisible. It made me ungraspable. And in that space, where I could no longer be pulled back through guilt or expectation, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stability. Not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time, my actions matched my values completely. The consequences hadn't begun yet, but they were inevitable, and I was ready to let them arrive. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, the way pressure does when it finally meets resistance. At first, it was tone. My mother's voice, once warm and conversational, became careful, measured, as if every word now carried weight she hadn't intended before. She spoke more formally, less freely. Compliments disappeared, so did casual affection. My father, on the other hand, grew distant. Calls shortened, responses slowed. Where he once offered opinions readily, he now withheld them, as if absence itself were a message. Neither of them said what they were feeling. They didn't have to. The shift was unmistakable. I had stopped being useful in the way they expected. And without that utility, they didn't quite know how to relate to me. Family gatherings changed next. Invitations became less enthusiastic, sometimes vague, sometimes delayed until the last minute. When I did attend, the atmosphere felt different, polite but strained. Conversations skirted around me rather than including me. I wasn't confronted, I was sidelined. It would have been easy to interpret this as punishment, and maybe part of it was, but more than that, it was disorientation. The family dynamic had been built with my compliance as a structural element. Remove it, and everything shifted. My parents spoke more often about how hard things were now, about stress, about uncertainty. They shared these things with an undertone I recognized immediately, not a request, but an appeal. Waiting for me to step in, waiting for me to soften, waiting for me to restore the balance. I didn't, not because I lacked empathy, but because I finally understood the cost of being the stabilizer. Every time I absorbed discomfort, it prevented others from adapting. It kept patterns intact that needed to change. One evening, my mother said quietly, "I didn't think you'd be this firm." The word landed between us. "I didn't either," I replied. She looked at me then, not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief. As if the version of me she'd relied on for decades had quietly stepped aside, leaving her without a script. That was when I realized the consequences weren't just happening to me, they were happening around me. My parents had to sit with uncertainty they'd never prepared for. They had to confront the possibility that their expectations were not guarantees. That concern, when tied to control, eventually meets resistance. And they didn't like that feeling. There were moments when guilt crept in. Not sharp or overwhelming, just a whisper. You could make this easier. You could smooth things over. You could fix this. But I recognized that voice now. It was the same one that had kept me compliant for years, and I let it pass. The hardest part wasn't their disappointment. It was accepting that their version of love had limits I hadn't wanted to see, limits that only revealed themselves when I said no. Still, I didn't retaliate. I didn't withdraw completely. I remained present, just not pliable. And slowly something else began to happen. The urgency in their appeals dulled. The waiting turned into adjustment. Not acceptance yet, but adaptation. They began making plans that didn't include me as a safety net. I watched this process with mixed emotions. Sadness, yes, but also relief. Because consequences, when allowed to unfold naturally, teach lessons that explanations never could. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving what I never owed. And in that absence, they were finally forced to see the structure as it really was. Unbalanced, fragile, unsustainable. The consequences had begun, not with punishment, with reality. The moment my parents realized something was truly wrong didn't come when I said no. It came later, when they understood that no explanation, no reframing, and no emotional appeal would bring the old version of me back. That realization unsettled them far more than refusal ever could. My mother tried first. Not directly, not honestly, but carefully. She softened her tone, returned to familiar language, and reached for nostalgia like a bridge. "Remember when we used to talk every day?" she said once, lightly. "You've always been such a good daughter," she added another time. Good. The word landed differently now. It wasn't praise. It was a reminder of a role I was expected to resume. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I also didn't move. When warmth didn't work, confusion followed. "I don't understand why you're being so guarded," she said. "We're not strangers." That was true. We weren't strangers. But we also weren't equal. My father's response came later, and it was sharper. Not loud. He was never loud, but edged with frustration. "Families don't operate like contracts," he said. "You can't just decide you're out." I looked at him calmly. "I didn't opt out of family," I replied. "I opted out of expectations that were never discussed." He shook his head, as if I were missing the point. Maybe, to him, I was. What they didn't understand, what made it too late to fix, was that I wasn't asking to be understood anymore. For years, I'd explained myself preemptively, translated my feelings, justified my limits. I'd tried to make my autonomy palatable. Now I wasn't offering that service. They attempted a compromise next, not about the money. Interestingly, that was never brought up directly again, but about involvement. "Maybe we just check in more," my mother suggested. "Maybe we can make decisions together again," my father added. Again. The word confirmed everything. I declined gently. "I'm comfortable with how things are." That sentence ended the conversation more definitively than any argument could have. From that point on, the panic set in. Not overt panic, not desperation, but subtle signs of it. Increased contact, sudden interest in my schedule, offers to help me with things I didn't need help with. They were trying to reinsert relevance. But relevance can't be forced once it's no longer granted freely. The hardest moment came when my mother said, very quietly, "I don't know where I stand with you anymore." I believed her, and for the first time, I didn't rush to reassure. "I'm still your daughter," I said. "That hasn't changed." She waited. "And?" she asked. I met her gaze. That doesn't mean that everything stays the same. That was the line she couldn't cross, the one she couldn't undo. Because what she wanted wasn't reassurance of a relationship. It was reassurance of access. And access, once withdrawn, cannot be negotiated back without consent. There was grief in that realization, for all of us. But there was also finality. Too late to fix it. But I didn't mean I was unwilling to connect. It meant the terms had changed permanently. The old dynamic, built on assumption and emotional leverage, was no longer available. No apology could restore it. No explanation could soften it. No guilt could override it. I had crossed from compliance into authorship, and that is a one-way passage. My parents eventually stopped trying to fix things. Not because they understood, but because they were forced to adapt. The system no longer responded to the inputs they'd always used. That was the true point of no return. Not the refusal, not the distance, but the moment they realized the structure itself was gone, and no amount of concern could rebuild it. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointing in its simplicity. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic declarations. Just three people sitting across from each other, realizing that something fundamental had shifted and that naming it wouldn't change it back. We met in a quiet cafe. Neutral ground. My mother suggested it, saying she wanted to clear the air. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I no longer felt threatened by the conversation. That was the difference. They arrived tense but composed. I arrived calm. My father spoke first. "We feel like we've lost you." The sentence was heavy, but familiar. It carried the weight of everything unsaid. "You haven't lost me," I replied. "You've lost access to decisions that were never meant to be shared." My mother flinched slightly, not at the words, but at the certainty behind them. "We were only trying to protect you," she said quickly. "Everything we did came from concern." "I know," I said, and I meant it. But concern doesn't justify control. There it was, calm, undeniable, unembellished. They tried to explain how hard things had been, how uncertain the world felt. Knowing I was stable made them feel safe. My father spoke about responsibility. My mother spoke about loyalty. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When they finished, I said, "I understand why you leaned on me. What I don't accept is that my stability became something you felt entitled to." Silence followed. This was the moment where, years earlier, I would have softened, added qualifiers, reassured them that I didn't blame them, that I wasn't angry, that everything was okay. This time I didn't, not because I wanted them to hurt, but because clarity doesn't need cushioning. My mother's voice trembled slightly. "So what are you saying? That we can't rely on you?" I looked at her steadily. "You can rely on my honesty, in my presence when I choose it, not on my sacrifice as a default." My father leaned back, exhaling slowly. "That's not how family works. That's how autonomy works," I replied. The words didn't escalate the conversation. They ended it. There was nothing left to argue once the premise itself was rejected. We sat there for a few moments longer, the noise of the cafe filling the space between us. Cups clinked, people laughed. Life moved on around a moment that, for us, felt quietly monumental. When we stood to leave, my mother reached for me instinctively, then hesitated. I noticed. She noticed that I noticed. She hugged me anyway. It was brief, careful. On the walk home, I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. Confrontation without heat doesn't scorch the earth. It redraws boundaries. It removes the emotional charge that keeps people locked in cycles. I hadn't convinced them. I hadn't needed to. What mattered was that I had spoken from a place that didn't seek approval. And that, more than anything I said, was what they couldn't undo. Who I am now is quieter than who I used to be, but far more solid. I'm no longer the person who measures her worth by how useful she is to others. I no longer confuse peace with self-erasure. I no longer mistake concern for care when it comes with strings attached. That doesn't mean I've become cold, or distant, or indifferent. It means I've become precise. My relationship with my parents still exists, but it's fundamentally different. There's more space in it now, more pauses, more moments where we don't quite know how to proceed. And strangely, that honesty feels healthier than the seamless closeness we once had. We talk less often. When we do, the conversations are lighter, safer. They no longer orbit around responsibility or expectation. They haven't returned to what they were, and they won't. I've made peace with that. What changed most wasn't my circumstances, it was my self-perception. I no longer see boundaries as something I need to justify. I see them as information, signals about where I end and others begin. They're not punishments. They're definition. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can say no and survive the fallout. I carry that confidence into every part of my life now. At work, in friendships, in new relationships. I no longer rush to fill silence or smooth tension that isn't mine to resolve. I let people show me who they are when I stop performing. And when someone reacts poorly to my boundaries, I don't rush to explain myself anymore. I listen. Their reaction tells me everything I need to know. I still believe in generosity, in the family, in showing up for people I care about. But I believe in chosen generosity now, not assumed sacrifice, not emotional debt. The $25,000 is still there, though it feels almost irrelevant now. It's no longer a symbol of obligation or leverage. It's simply a resource I manage responsibly for my own life. What matters more is what I gained by refusing to hand it over. Clarity, agency, a sense of authorship I didn't know I was missing. I don't resent my parents. I don't vilify them. They operated from fear, not malice, from a model of family that blurred love and control in ways they likely never examined. But I examined it. And once you do that, you can't unknow it. If there's a lesson in who I am now, it's this. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your life. You don't have to dramatize your boundaries for them to be real. You don't have to be understood to be free. Quiet dominance isn't about power over others. It's about power over yourself. I didn't change overnight. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't demand apologies. I simply stopped offering what I never consented to give. And in doing so, I became someone I trust. There's a particular kind of relief that comes not from being validated, but from being aligned. That's what remained after everything settled. Not triumph, not vindication. Alignment. For a long time, I believed that love meant availability, that loyalty meant access, that being a good daughter meant staying legible, predictable, and endlessly accommodating. Those beliefs weren't imposed on me all at once. They were taught gently, reinforced subtly, and rewarded consistently. That's why they were so hard to question. What this experience taught me is that control rarely looks like control when it first appears. It looks like a concern. It sounds like worry. It arrives wrapped in familiarity and framed as protection. And because it doesn't shout, because it doesn't threaten, until it does, we excuse it. We normalize it. But love that depends on your compliance isn't love. It's management. That doesn't make the people who practice it villains. Often it makes them afraid. Afraid of uncertainty. Afraid of losing relevance. Afraid of confronting limits they've never had to face before. Understanding that allowed me to let go without bitterness. I didn't win by keeping my savings. I won by keeping my authorship, by choosing not to trade my future for temporary peace, by learning that saying no, clearly, calmly, and without justification, is sometimes the most honest thing you can do. If you're listening to this and feeling a quiet recognition, I want you to know something important. You're not cruel for wanting autonomy. You're not selfish for protecting what you've built. And you're not obligated to explain yourself into exhaustion so others can feel comfortable. You're allowed to disappoint people who benefited from your silence. You're allowed to outgrow roles you never agreed to play. And you're allowed to do it without shouting, without cutting ties, without becoming someone you don't recognize. Quiet dominance isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek witnesses. It's the moment you stop negotiating your worth. If this story resonates with you, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a situation where concern slowly turned into expectation, where love felt conditional on what you were willing to give? Or have you ever said no and discovered that the reaction told you more than the request ever did? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful clarity comes not from answers, but from realizing you're not alone.